passing by a town from outside. You do not know who the owner of the fire is. You do not know who lit the fire. Can you say a bracha on it or not? Says the Gemara. Im rov nochrim eno mevarech. Im rov Yisrael mevarech. You go after the majority. Generally speaking, in the Torah, we have a concept, which is a biblical concept, acharei rabim la'atot, that you follow the majority, and the Torah gives you allowance and the right to assume that what you don't know where it comes from, it actually comes from the rov. Now, we will discuss just momentarily, there is a concept, very complicated concept in Shas called kol hakavua kemechese al mechse dami. When you have a majority and minority, but there is a set amount of minority somewhere, and you are dealing with the place of the mix, you ought to assume that everything is 50-50. Like, all odds are off, basically, of the majority. You follow the 50-50 chance, which we're not going to really discuss because that makes it way more complicated than we want it to be for this shiur. But nevertheless, if you don't have that area of complexity, normally speaking, we follow the majority. You're allowed to follow the majority. For instance, you have things that could be infested with bugs, and more times than not, they are infested with bugs, right? Many green, leafy is green anyways, right? Yeah, most of those things, not most, but many species of green leafy things are infested, especially given the time of the year and so on. So then, from the Torah, if it's more than 50% of the time that they are infested with bugs, then biblically speaking, you cannot eat any of them until you check them to make sure that they are clean of infestation of bugs. Because again, acharei rabim la'atot, if more times than not, they are not infested, let's say it's 40% of the time that they're infested with bugs, not 50. So then, midoraita is not considered infested unless you know, but midrabanan, as long as it is miuta matsui, as long as it is a minority that is still, you could still find often, but it's not majority. For instance, the Mishkanot Yaakov says 10% and up is already considered a minority of such level. Then you are obligated to check it, and it will be asur to eat it beforehand without checking and ensuring that it is actually indeed considered not infested. But if it is rov, then it's midoraita, then you're talking about a biblical issue, not a rabbinic issue. So says the Gemara, you go after majority over here. If the majority of town are goyim, then you cannot say bracha moreh ha'esh on that fire. If the majority are Jews, then you can. So what's the obvious question with that? Says the Gemara, hagufa kasha. What you're saying from the beginning to the end does not add up, because Amrat, you started saying im rov nochrim eno mevarech, that if the majority are goyim, you don't say bracha. When I say that to you, and you are to dissect and understand the wording, you would say, well, if rov are nochrim, you don't say bracha, but if 50-50, then you can. But then you end up saying, if the majority are Yisrael, you could say bracha, which means, will infer that if you have mechse al mechse, if you have half and half, you cannot say bracha. So in the beginning, you tell me, if you have majority goyim, you can't, which would indicate 50-50 is good. Then you say if you have majority Israel, you can, which would say 50-50 is not good. So is 50-50 good or not good? Says the Gemara. המחצה על מחצה מברך, והדר תני, עם רוב ישראל מברך. המחצה על מחצה אינו מברך. So make your mind, what is the halacha by 50-50? Says the Gemara, no. בדינו דאפילו מחצה על מחצה נמי מברך. Even 50-50, you could say bracha. Ve'aydi de tani resha, rov nochrim, tani sefa, rov Israel. Because in the beginning it says rov nochrim, it uses the same language to rhyme and says rov Israel at the end. But really, the first diuk of the Braita is the one that's ikar, that if there's majority nochrim, you can't say the bracha 50-50 would be good, which the Meiri explains. It says, well, you have this is a safek sfeka already, because the half, maybe it is from a goy, maybe it's from a yid, and if it is, even if it is from a goy, maybe, as we said yesterday, it has been made without any desecration of Shabbat, no melacha has been done with it, and so on. So you could say bracha on it, technically speaking. So therefore, says the Meiri, you have a safek sefeka lehakel, a double doubt. A double doubt means, well, maybe it is a ner of Yisrael, and then you could say bracha on it simply so. And even if it's not, if it's a goy's, then still maybe you could say, because we mentioned that if you didn't use it for malacha, then it's fine. And basically, mikar adin and erav akum also is fine. So therefore, says the Meiri, but maybe you could say the other way around. You could say a safek sfeka, a double doubt, to be stringent. How so? In other words, this is something you could twist. You could say, well, if we're talking about statistics, I could say statistics this way. I could say statistics this way. Now you're telling me that is a safek sefeka, a double doubt for being lenient, because maybe it's a Jews, and even if it's not the Jews, maybe it's a type of a goy's light that he could say bracha. So that's a double doubt to be mekil. Let's make this easier, by the way, to understand it as the Rashba understands. If it's 50-50, that's one safek. Then you have another 50-50 within that. So you add the statistics, you'll end up with 75% versus 25%, which would be rov. So even though that you have a safek of a 50-50, you really have a 75-25, not a 50-50. That's how Rashba understands safek sfeka. But says the Meiri, I could say the same thing in a stringent way. How so? Like this, easy. Maybe it is a light of a goy, and you can't say bracha on it. And even if you want to tell me it's a light of a yid, maybe he lit it for kavod, not for light. Right? As we're going to see soon, only a light you could say bracha on that was lit for lighting purposes, not for kavod purposes. Right? So even if it's a light of a yid, not always you could say bracha on it. So maybe it's a goy's and you can't say bracha. And even if it's a yid's, maybe it is a type of a light that you can't say bracha of meoreh ha'esh on. Says the Meiri, you know why we don't say that? Because the whole thing is a derabanan. And once you're dealing with the derabanan, safek derabanan, lekula. You're more allowed to be lenient in a rabbinic doubt. So therefore, we go towards the leniency, not towards the stringency.
Right.
Says the Gemara.
Rabbi, so you say a bracha when you see a fire or when you're going to use the fire?
We're going to discuss that in the next Amud. So says the Gemara, this is part of how big he has to be, how close he has to be, and all of that. So says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, the line starts with Tanu Rabbanan. Hayam alech chutz lekrach. If you were walking outside the city, you see a kid with a torch in his hand walking. So can you assume that it's a yid and you say bracha on it, or can you not? Says the Gemara, you have to check. Bodek acharav, you check. Im Yisraelu, if he is a Yid, mevarech. Im nochriu, eno mevarech. Right? My iriya tinok. The Gemara says, why do you have to say tinok? Why a kid? Why not an adult? Gadol nami. The same halacha would apply by a gadol as well. You see a gadol, you see an adult walking with a torch in their hand, and he says Shema Yisrael, right? And they finish the sentence. You check that they are a Yid. You should be able to say the bracha on it. What's the specific thing about the katan? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Hacha besamuch l'shkiat hachamas. We're talking about right after Shabbat, like mamash right after Shabbat. Usually, an adult would not go out with an avukah right after Shabbat. Kids, they want to go somewhere, want to go to the friend's house, whatnot. You could have a kid right after Shabbat with a torch. So therefore, if you see an adult at that time of the day, you assume that it's a nochri. And therefore, it's not a question. But a kid still is a possibility that he's a Yid. And that's the chidush of this braita, that you ask them, and if you verify that they're a Yid, then, of course, you could say it. Tinok, Emor Yisrael hu akri v'nakid. Sometimes it happens that they go out right after Shabbat, Tinok. So therefore, you could check, and if they're indeed a Yid, you could say a bracha. Tan Rabbanan, haya mehalech chutz lakrach. If you are going outside a city, v'ra'a or, and you see fire, im ava kepia kivshan mevarech alav. If it's a large fire, kepia kivshan, like the opening of a tanur, of a large tanur, then you say bracha on it, because that shows that this fire was lit for lighting purposes. If you want to warm yourself up, or you want to cook something, what type of fire do you make? Especially back in the day, that every piece of wood mattered. They weren't rich like us, that they have everything in the store, in the packages. Every little thing matters. If you want to warm yourself up, or you want to cook something, you make a small fire. You sit by it, or you cook by it. If you make a bonfire, a large fire, then at least one of the purposes that you're lighting it is for lighting purposes. And therefore, says the Gemara, the size of it, if it's kefia kivshan, if it's a minimum of a pia kivshan, mevarech ala, because that proves that the reason they lit this fire was for lighting purposes as well, at least.
What about for warmth? I mean, if you make a big fire for warmth, and let's say you don't need illumination per se. Why is that not discussed?
We're talking about the norm. The norm is if it's for warmth, you do a little thing and you stand over it to warm yourself up. If you're making a bonfire, you need it for more than just warmth. So says the Gemara, it has to be kepia kivshan, and if not, you don't say the bracha. Tani chada, or shel kivshan mevarchin alav, v'tanya idach and mevarchin alav. We have two apparently contradictory braitas about the fire of a kivshan, of a fireplace, of a large kivshan, a large fireplace. It says the Gemara, lo kasha, it's not a stira. Ha betchila, ha lebasof. In the beginning, it's different than at the end. Why is it different? Because in the beginning, when kivshan, they used to use it for baking bricks, right? Baking bricks. So in the beginning, you light enough fire to bake bricks, and it's primarily for baking bricks. But at the end, when your process is done, then you do it because you want to know also how much of them are already baked well. So you make a bigger fire in order to have light enough to see what's happening there. And that's how Rabbi Yonah understands it. Rashi has a slightly different understanding. So therefore, it is also for, at least, it's also for light. not just for baking. That's the minimum, that it is for both things together, and therefore you could say bracha on it. So when you have a braita that says by kivshan, you can't, it's talking about kivshan in the beginning of the baking process. When you say you can say borei moreh ha'esh is when they have the big fire at the end, that it is also made for the illumination, that to see what exactly is going on there. Tani Chadam, we have one braita, again, an apparent contradiction in braitas about the fire of tanur and kirayim. We have learned in Chot Shabbat together that tanur and kirayim are two different ovens, home ovens that they had. Tanur was with one opening on the bottom, and it was taller. The circumference and the diameter basically was getting smaller and smaller until the top, and you have one pot on top of it. That's tanur, and kirayim was a more of a rectangular cube that had two places, and on top of it you had two different places for pots. So you have the fire there inside the tanur or inside the kirayim, and you're seeing that. You want to know if you could say borei moreh ha'esh on Dada Motzei Shabbat or not, and there is an apparent stira between two braitas whether or not you could say it. So says the Gemara, you have one braita that says you can. Tani chada orsha tanur v'kirayim mevarachin alav. One of the braitas says you can say borei moreh ha'esh. The other braita says you cannot say bracha on it. So which one is it? Lo kasha, says the Gemara. It depends. In the beginning, it is for cooking purposes. You don't do it. But at the end, they would put a little bit of wood in the beginning, the opening of the tanur, in order to stop the thing from coming out, the heat from coming out, but that was also for the lighting purposes as well. Now, therefore, because you put at the end you put extra wood there, which is for lighting purposes as well, that process that you have at the end, even though that is for stopping the heat to get out, but it's also for lighting purposes, and you have two purposes. Lighting is one of them. You could say bracha. Says the Gemara. One braita says if you have light in Bet Knesset and Bet Midrash on Motzei Shabbat, you could say bracha on it. You have, flames, you have torches, whatever it is, in Bet Knesset and Bet Midrash, you could say bracha. And another braita, another braita says you cannot say bracha. So what's the reconciliation? Says the Gemara, lo kasha. It's not a question. Hadika adam chashuv. The Gemara is going to go through three different ways of answering this. Hadika adam chashuv, hadeleka adam chashuv. Sometimes you have a very distinguished, important personality as guest in the shul, in the Bet Midrash, in the Bet Knesset, and you don't just light one candle for them to be able to not fall when they're walking, but you light up the whole place for their kavod. It's not that you need the light and you lit it up because you need the light. No, you need one candle or one torch. And when he walks with that, you're good to go. So why are you lighting up the whole place? For kavod. Because he's an important figure. You want the entire place to be beautiful and nice. And we mentioned before already that a fire that has been lit for kavod, what's the halacha? En mevarchin alav. You can't say bracha on it, right? So therefore, if you have an adam chashuv, then you cannot say bracha of borei moreh. But if there is no adam chashuv and the whole Bet Knesset is lit, it means that you have more people there, perhaps, or whatnot, and you need the light for lighting purposes. When they lit up the torches in the shul, they did all of them for lighting purposes, not for kavod. So it really depends who you have there. If you have an important, distinguished guest, it actually ruins it for you. Now you cannot say borei moreh. Says the Gemara, If you want, I could even say that both of them are talking about the case that you do have an Adam Chashuv. That Hava had the Ika Adam Chashuv. Velo kasha, still not a question. Had the Ika Chazana, had the Leka Chazana. In some of the Bate Knesset, back in the day, the Chazana Knesset, the Shamash of the Shul, used to live in the Shul. Where do you think he lived? He lived in the Shul. And therefore, it's not just the Adam Chashuv, but this guy has to live there. So he goes around, he needs light. So it was lit, the place was lit up for the kavod of the Adam Chashuv, but also for the Chazan Bet HaKnesset. So therefore, it was also for lighting purposes, not just for kavod, and you could make a bracha b'rei moreh ha'esh. So if you have Chazan of the Bet Knesset who lives there, even if you have Adam Chashuv, you can still say b'rei moreh ha'esh. If there is an Adam Chashuv, but there is no Chazan Bet Knesset, so then primarily the torches have been lit for kavod of this Adam Chashuv, and you cannot say b'rei moreh ha'esh on those. Third reconciliation of the Gemara, the third answer, the Gemara says, a third answer, I could tell you, we're talking about a case that you have an Adam Chashuv, you have a distinguished guest, and you have a Chazan in the Bet Knesset also, and still there is machloket. Hadeika sihara v'hadeleka sihara. One of them is talking about a nice 15th night of the 14th night of the month, the full moon, clear sky. You could see everything with the moonlight, right? You could see everything with the moonlight, and therefore, the Chazan of the Bet Knesset doesn't need torches to see what he's doing. He could see everything in the moonlight, and therefore, it's only lit. Even though that you have Chazan living in the shul, it's only lit for the Adam Chashuv guy that's in the shul, and therefore it's a ner shel kavod. You cannot say bracha. But if there is no sihara, if there's no moonlight, natural light, then the light is considered for both Adam Chashuv and the Chazan Bet Knesset. It's mutar, right? We when we hear about like moonlight, who lives in the moonlight? But people actually use moonlight. By Yeshiva Zatzal, Rabbi Ruderman, alav shalom, he was known to have had a photographic memory from a young age of 3-4. He was already known in his town in Europe, that he was something a rising star, and so on. So one of his talmidim actually in Baltimore was a very beloved student of his that was also a very capable mind, was Reb Nachman Klein. Even though that he worked actually on the side, he was a mechanic, but he had the most popular Daf Yomi shir in Baltimore. He was a very, very interesting personality. Alav Shalom, he passed away recently, a few years ago. So he once told me that the Shiva gave a shir, and he mentioned the Or Sameach. He mentioned the Rabbi Meir Simcha Midubinsk, and he said that he has, I think the way he said it says there's 12 answers at this question, and he mentioned the shiur, the 12 answers. So he said, I went and I had the yeshiva had the Or Sameach. So I looked at the Or Sameach inside, and I saw the yeshiva missed one answer. He actually has one more answer that he didn't say. So I was excited. I went to the Rosh Yeshiva. I was like, he has another one. So he said, what do you expect from me? I learned Or Sameach only one time, 60 years ago. And how did I learn it? There was no Or Sameach in Europe, in our yeshiva, in Salbotka, where he learned. He said there was one copy of Or Sameach that was brought to yeshiva as a loan, basically. And all of the top students, they got a few hours to have it. So you could either have it during the day or during the night. But the night was longer because who wants to learn it during the night? So because the night was longer, I got the night shift and I stayed up in the moonlight and I finished the entire Sefer of Or Sameach, a complicated Sefer, in moonlight during one night. So he says, okay, so I must have skipped or not seen or not remembered that answer of the Or Sameach from 60 years ago when I finished the entire thing in the moonlight on one night. So that's the story he said in one of the yortzites of the Yeshiva Zatzal. So that's the the moonlight, you think you can't live in the moonlight, you could actually.
Rabbi, before you go, all these contradictions with the Barai says, does the Gemara expect us to provide the answers without?
The Gemara is just explaining different scenarios that are actually many of them halachic, and we deduce this from the different braitas. And the Gemara says, well, yes, because you could have a scenario that you have a shul that you can't say bracha on it because the lights were not for usage, were just extra lights for respecting someone respectful. You cannot say bracha on that. But you could have that case, but you could, because even though that you have Adam Chashub, you have also a Chazan. So he needs it for his living usage, and therefore he could say, but if you have a moonlight already, then you don't really need it. So therefore it's primarily lit for, so you have like fine tuning of this that you learn from
Right, but the
different braitas.
all these question marks that all these answers, these questions they are asking you, without, do they expect us to think about them and to kind of try to provide the answers, or to just read through them? Should we think?
No, this is how the process of the Gemara works. We have the Tarash Baal Peh. The Tarash Baal Peh is the explanation of the halachot, and it has it in different ways, and questioning and answering, and the logic that goes behind it becomes what we call the Rambam calls part of Tarash Baal Peh when you actually come to conclusion of halacha. The process in which you get to that result is called Gemara. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, hayu yoshvim bebet